No man dared to marry the obese black woman until the millionaire said, "I will." For years, she lived in silence, mocked and overlooked, carrying kindness in her heart while the world turned away. But when one bold vow is made in front of the entire town, everything changes. Suddenly, whispers turn into poison accusations of gold digging, betrayal, and scandal. She tries to walk away to protect him, but what secret truth from her past could make this love stronger than hate? And when the whole town stands against them, will his promise be enough to break the chains of shame, or will she lose everything again? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late summer sun blazed overhead as Caroline Walker carefully arranged crystal punch bowls on the folding tables outside First Baptist Church. Sweet tea and fresh squeezed lemonade sparkled in the afternoon light, looking just as refreshing as the gentle breeze that rustled through the oak trees. All around her, the annual church social was in full swing, with folding tables groaning under the weight of covered dishes, golden-crusted pies, and steaming casseroles. Caroline smoothed down her carefully chosen yellow dress and tried to focus on her task. She'd spent hours preparing her famous 7-layer salad and banana pudding, hoping they might help her feel more welcome among the congregation. But even as she poured lemonade with practiced grace, she couldn't ignore the whispers and sidelong glances that followed her every move. Bless her heart, she heard Mrs. Jenkins murmur to her friend, not quite quietly enough, "She tries so hard, doesn't she?" A group of deacons gathered near the dessert table, their laughter carrying across the churchyard. Caroline's hand trembled slightly as she filled another plastic cup, catching fragments of their conversation. "Might need a bigger pew." One man chuckled, earning knowing smirks from his companions. Only the children seemed truly happy to see her. Little Sarah Miller bounced over, her braids swinging. "Miss Caroline, can I have extra ice in mine, please?" Caroline's genuine smile emerged as she carefully added extra ice cubes to Sarah's cup. "There you go, sweet pea. Be careful not to spill." The afternoon wore on, growing warmer and more humid. Caroline continued her duties, determined to serve with dignity despite the uncomfortable moisture gathering at her neck and under her arms. She'd learned long ago to wear dark colors to hide the sweat, but today she'd wanted to feel pretty, to feel like she belonged. The social coordinator, Mrs. Beth Ann Patterson, clinked her glass for attention. "Time for our annual matchmaking game, everyone. All our single folks, gather round." Caroline's stomach clenched. She tried to make herself smaller behind the drink table, but Mrs. Patterson's voice rang out. "Caroline Walker, don't be shy. Come join us." Reluctantly, Caroline made her way to the group. The game involved women standing in a circle while men chose partners for a dance. Her heart pounded as the music started. That's when Mr. Harold Freeman, one of the church elders, spoke up loud enough for everyone to hear. "Now, let's be realistic here. Some folks just aren't meant for marriage. Wouldn't be fair to saddle any good Christian man with that kind of burden." The churchyard fell silent except for a few poorly concealed snickers. Caroline felt heat rush to her face as dozens of eyes turned toward her. The beautiful yellow dress suddenly felt like a spotlight, drawing attention to every curve she'd tried so hard to disguise. Without a word, Caroline lowered her eyes to the ground. Her cheeks burned with humiliation as scattered laughter rippled through the crowd. With as much dignity as she could muster, she turned and walked away from the circle, away from the churchyard, the sound of cruel laughter following her retreat. The setting sun painted long shadows across the dusty road as Caroline Walker made her slow journey home. Her yellow dress, once crisp and hopeful, now hung limp in the evening humidity. The wicker basket that had carried her carefully prepared dishes swung empty at her side, a reminder of another Sunday social gone wrong. Her sensible shoes kicked up small clouds with each step. The crickets had started their evening chorus, and fireflies began to dance in the ditches alongside the road. Caroline lifted her face to catch the cooling breeze, grateful that at least nature didn't judge her worth by her size. The distant purr of an engine broke through her thoughts. Headlights swept across her back, and she moved closer to the edge of the road, expecting the car to pass by like all the others. Instead, the vehicle, a sleek, black luxury car that seemed out of place on their humble streets, slowed to match her pace. Caroline's heart quickened, but before anxiety could take hold, a warm, familiar voice called out, "Caroline? Caroline Walker?" She turned to see a tall, well-dressed black man stepping out of the car. His tailored suit spoke of big city success, but his smile carried the warmth of their small-town roots. Thomas Grayson. She recognized him immediately, though it had been nearly 20 years. "Thomas?" she said softly, memories flooding back. "You remember me?" His eyes crinkled with genuine pleasure. "I wasn't sure you would." "Of course I do. How could she forget?" He had been a hungry teenager, proud but desperate, and she had shared her mama's fresh-baked bread with him. It was before he'd left town, before he'd made his fortune. Thomas stepped closer, his expression growing serious. I never forgot your kindness that day. You didn't just give me bread, you gave it with dignity. No judgment, no pity. Just, he gestured with his hands, searching for the right words, just pure goodness. Caroline clutched her basket tighter, uncomfortable with praise. Anyone would have done the same. No, Thomas said firmly. They wouldn't have, and I suspect you're still just as kind now as you were then. His words, spoken with such certainty, made her throat tight with emotion. After the humiliation at the church social, his recognition of her character rather than her appearance touched something deep within her. Let me drive you home, he offered, gesturing to his car. Oh no, I couldn't. Caroline started to protest. Please. The day's cooling down, but it's still warm enough. Something in his gentle insistence made it hard to refuse. Caroline nodded, and Thomas opened the passenger door with a flourish that made her smile despite herself. At her front porch, Caroline stepped out of the car, murmuring a quiet, "Thank you." She hurried inside, her heart beating an unfamiliar rhythm, closing the door behind her with trembling hands. Outside, Thomas remained by his car, his eyes drawn to the soft light that now glowed from her window. A thoughtful smile played across his face as he observed the familiar silhouette. She hasn't changed, he mused to himself, except she's even stronger now. The morning sun cast cheerful rays across Main Street as Caroline arranged pies on the checkered tablecloth. The annual charity auction had transformed the town square into a bustling marketplace, with colorful banners fluttering between lampposts and folding tables lined up in neat rows. Caroline had positioned herself behind the pie stall, hoping the tower of desserts would shield her from unwanted attention. Her own contributions, 3 sweet potato pies made from her grandmother's recipe, sat proudly among the others. The familiar work of organizing and serving gave her hands something to do, even as her heart felt heavy from Sunday's humiliation. Children darted between the tables, their laughter mixing with the general chatter of townsfolk examining handmade quilts and homegrown vegetables. Caroline managed a genuine smile as little Sarah Jenkins pointed excitedly at a cherry pie, tugging on her mother's dress. Would you believe they're letting just anybody handle the food now? The cruel voice cut through the pleasant morning air like a knife. Caroline's hands froze on the edge of a pie tin. She recognized that voice, belonging to Marcus Wheeler, the same man who had mocked her at the church social. I mean, look at her. She's probably eaten half the pies already. The words rang out loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear. Conversations stopped, heads turned. The children's laughter died away. Caroline felt her cheeks burning as she stared down at the pies, willing herself to disappear. More snickers joined Wheeler's laughter. Maybe we should auction off a diet plan instead of desserts. Caroline's vision blurred with unshed tears. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. The urge to run was overwhelming, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. That's quite enough. The commanding voice silenced the laughter. Thomas Grayson stepped forward from the crowd, his presence drawing all eyes away from Caroline. He moved with purposeful strides until he stood beside her table. Mr. Wheeler, Thomas said, his tone carrying the weight of his success and authority, I suggest you consider how your words reflect on your own character rather than Miss Walker's. Before Wheeler could respond, Thomas turned to face Caroline. His expression softened as he reached for her hand, which trembled slightly as she placed it in his. He drew himself up to his full height, addressing not just Wheeler but the entire gathered crowd. If no man will have the courage, then I will. I'll marry her. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Caroline's hand shook harder in Thomas's steady grip as whispers erupted around them. She stared up at him, her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear anything else over its rhythm. The morning sun seemed to pause in its arc across the sky, holding this moment in its golden light, as the town square fell into stunned silence. The kitchen clock ticked steadily as Caroline paced back and forth across her worn linoleum floor. Her modest home felt smaller than usual tonight, the walls seeming to close in with each turn she made. The events from the town square played over and over in her mind, like a record stuck on repeat. She wrung her hands, pausing to stare out her small window at the quarter moon hanging in the velvet sky. The neighborhood had grown quiet, with only the occasional cricket chirping in the distance. Her thoughts whirled like autumn leaves in a storm. Why would Thomas Grayson, successful, handsome Thomas, make such a declaration? It didn't make sense. 3 sharp knocks at her door made her jump. Caroline's heart leaped into her throat as she recognized Thomas's tall silhouette through the curtained window. Caroline? His voice was gentle but firm. Please, I'd like to explain. She smoothed her dress with trembling hands and opened the door. Thomas stood on her small porch, his confident posture somewhat softened by the genuine concern in his eyes. May I come in? He asked. Caroline nodded, stepping aside. Thomas entered her kitchen, his expensive suit looking out of place among her humble furnishings. He didn't seem to notice or care about the contrast. "I know my announcement today was unexpected," he began, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "But I need you to understand something." Caroline leaned against her counter, arms crossed protectively across her middle. "Mr. Grayson, you don't have to, Thomas," he corrected softly. "And yes, I do." He took a deep breath. "Do you remember that day you gave me bread? I was 12 years old, hungry, too proud to ask for help." Caroline nodded slowly. "You were sitting behind the school. What you might not know is that my mother, she was a climb to revel. Black woman who cleaned houses for a living. She struggled every day with the same kind of prejudice you face now." His voice grew thick with emotion. "She died when I was 15, but she taught me to recognize true kindness when I see it." Caroline's eyes widened at this revelation. She had never known about Thomas's mother. "That day you shared your lunch with me," he continued. "You didn't just give me food, you showed me dignity when I needed it most. The same dignity I see in you every day, despite how this town treats you." He took a step closer. "I owe you more than you know, Caroline. But this isn't about debt, it's about who you are, who you've always been." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with sincerity. After a moment, he moved toward the door. "I meant what I said today, every word." He paused at the threshold. "Good night, Caroline." She managed a soft good night as he left, closing the door quietly behind him. Caroline leaned against the solid wood, her heart racing with uncertainty. In the darkness of her kitchen, she whispered to herself, "Does he mean it, or is this just pity?" The morning sun streamed through the window of Johnson's grocery, casting long shadows across the produce aisle, where Caroline carefully selected tomatoes. She could feel the weight of stairs pressing against her back, heavier than her shopping basket. "Can you believe the nerve?" a woman's whisper carried clearly from the next aisle. "Going after Thomas Grayson's money like that." Caroline's hands trembled as she picked up another tomato, pretending not to hear. The fruit felt too soft, bruised perhaps, just like her heart. "My Herald says it's a scandal," another voice chimed in. "Says Thomas Grayson's lost his mind, letting himself be trapped by..." The rest of the sentence dissolved into meaningful looks and barely concealed sneers. Caroline placed the tomato back, her appetite for shopping suddenly gone. She made her way to the checkout counter, where Mrs. Johnson barely met her eyes while ringing up her meager purchases. The whispers followed her everywhere. At Hal's barber shop, the usual friendly chatter died as she passed by the window. Inside, men's heads bent together in heated discussion, their expressions a mix of disapproval and morbid fascination. Even the sanctuary of church offered no peace. During Wednesday night prayer meeting, Caroline sat in her usual spot near the back, feeling the weight of judgment from the pews around her. Elder William's wife made a point of moving to a different row, dragging her reluctant husband along. "It's not right," someone muttered loud enough for Caroline to hear. "Gold digger. She's making a fool of that poor man." But not everyone joined in the chorus of criticism. Miss Martha, who Caroline had nursed through pneumonia last winter, reached over and squeezed her hand. And young Billy Thompson's mother defended her at the church door, saying, "Caroline's got the kindest heart in town. Thomas Grayson could do a lot worse." These small gestures of support were drops of comfort in an ocean of disapproval, but they couldn't completely wash away the pain of the cruel words. That evening, as the sun set and cast long shadows through her bedroom window, Caroline could hear raised voices from her neighbors' porches. The Hendersons next door were having a heated discussion about her situation. "It ain't natural," Mr. Henderson declared. "A man like him with someone like..." "Now, Joe," his wife interrupted. "Remember when Caroline sat with our Mary during her fever? Not everyone would have done that." Caroline sank to her knees beside her bed, tears flowing freely now. The worn quilt beneath her fingers was the same one she'd had since childhood, a reminder of simpler times before her world had turned upside down. "Dear Lord," she whispered, her voice breaking, "please show me the way. I don't know what to do anymore." Her tears fell onto clasped hands as she prayed, while, outside, the argument between neighbors continued, some voices raised in criticism, others offering quiet defense of the woman who had always been there when they needed her. The morning light had barely touched Caroline's porch when she heard the rumble of a car pulling into her driveway. Through the window, she spotted Thomas's tall figure emerging from his sleek vehicle, arms loaded with paper bags and what looked like a bouquet of bright yellow daisies. Her heart fluttered as she opened the door. Thomas stood there with a warm smile, looking slightly disheveled despite his expensive clothes. "I thought maybe we could make breakfast together," he said, lifting the grocery bags. "Though I should warn you, my cooking skills are pretty terrible." Caroline couldn't help but smile at his earnest expression. "You didn't have to bring all this," she said softly, but stepped aside to let him in. "These are for you." Thomas handed her the daisies, their cheerful faces seeming to nod in the morning breeze. I remembered you used to grow them in your mother's garden. Caroline's eyes widened. You remember that? I remember more than you think, he said quietly, following her into the kitchen. The morning sun streamed through her small kitchen window as Thomas unpacked the bags, eggs, fresh vegetables, eggs, bread, and even a package of bacon. When he pulled out a cutting board and grabbed a knife to chop onions, Caroline had to stifle a laugh at his awkward grip. Here, let me show you, she said, moving beside him. You're holding it like you're afraid it might bite. Thomas chuckled, his shoulders relaxing. I told you I was terrible. My expertise ends at making coffee and ordering takeout. As Caroline demonstrated the proper technique, their hands briefly touched, sending a warm tingle up her arm. She quickly stepped back, busying herself with the eggs, the kitchen filled with the sizzle of bacon and the rhythmic sound of Thomas's increasingly confident chopping. Every now and then, he'd make an exaggerated face of concentration that would set Caroline giggling despite herself. I think this onion is winning, Thomas declared, wiping his eyes. Are they supposed to fight back this hard? Caroline laughed outright at that, the sound surprising her with its freedom. Maybe they know you're new at this, and they're testing you. They worked side by side, the initial awkwardness melting away like butter in a warm pan. Thomas told stories about his mishaps in fancy restaurants, and Caroline shared tales of teaching neighborhood children to bake cookies. When they finally sat down at her small table, the morning had stretched into early afternoon. Sunlight danced across their plates of slightly messy but delicious omelets. Thomas had insisted on setting the table with the daisies in a mason jar as a centerpiece. This is nice, Thomas said softly, watching as Caroline took another bite. Just being here with you. Caroline felt something warm bloom in her chest, different from the earlier nervousness. She found herself laughing at another one of his stories, the sound coming naturally now, filling her small dining room with joy. For the first time since his surprising announcement in the town square, she wasn't thinking about what others might say or whether this was real. She was simply enjoying the moment, realizing how comfortable it felt to share her table, her laughter, her morning with him. The Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, with just enough breeze to rustle the leaves along the riverbank. Thomas had arrived at Caroline's door in casual clothes, a simple button-down shirt and khakis, looking more relaxed than his usual business attire. I thought we could take a walk, he said, gesturing toward the old dirt path that led to the river. There's something I'd like to share with you. Caroline nodded, pulling her light sweater closer around her shoulders. They walked in comfortable silence at first, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The river sparkled ahead of them, its waters dancing with sunlight. I used to come here as a boy, Thomas said, stopping at a weathered wooden bench overlooking the water. My mother would bring me here when things got difficult in town. Caroline sat beside him, watching his face grow distant with memories. The bench creaked softly beneath them. You remember my mother? He asked, turning to look at her. She was like you in many ways, strong, kind, always helping others despite what people said or did. I remember her, Caroline said softly. She always had a smile for everyone, even those who didn't deserve it. Thomas picked up a small stone, turning it over in his hands. She faced so much hatred, so much discrimination. Being a black woman in this town wasn't easy back then. Still isn't. He tossed the stone into the river, watching the ripples spread. But she never let it break her spirit. He turned to face Caroline fully now, his eyes intense. Do you remember that day behind the school? I was 12 years old, and some boys were throwing rocks at me, calling me names because of my mother. Caroline's breath caught. She did remember. You stepped between us, Thomas continued, his voice thick with emotion. You were just a young girl yourself, but you stood there like a shield, told them they should be ashamed of themselves. You walked me home that day, gave me half your sandwich. Thomas, Caroline whispered, her heart aching at the memory. You were so brave, he said, reaching for her hand. Just like my mother, you both had that same strength, that same dignity in the face of cruelty. But Caroline pulled her hand away, something tightening in her chest. She could feel the weight of his words, the burden of his memories pressing down on her shoulders. It was too much, this comparison, this idealization. I'm not your mother, she whispered, standing up from the bench. Her voice trembled but held firm. Don't carry her burden onto me. The words hung between them like a heavy curtain, and silence fell over the riverbank. Only the sound of running water and distant birdsong filled the space between them as they sat there, each lost in their own thoughts, the morning sun climbing higher in the sky. Caroline stood in her kitchen early Wednesday morning, surrounded by grocery lists and recipes scattered across her worn wooden table. Her fingers traced the familiar handwriting, his known on her mother's recipes, passed down through generations. A gentle knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. I brought everything on the list, Thomas said, his arms laden with paper bags. Behind him, more bags filled the back seat of his car. though I still think you're being too modest about the budget. I could easily— No, Caroline interrupted softly but firmly. This needs to come from the heart, not just money. These families don't need charity, they need dignity. Together, they carried the supplies to the church hall kitchen. The morning light streamed through dusty windows as they set up their workstation. Caroline tied an apron around her waist, then handed one to Thomas. I warn you, she said with a small smile, this is going to be hard work. For hours, they worked side by side. Caroline showed Thomas how to properly dice onions, her hands guiding his on the knife. She stirred enormous pots of beef stew while he mixed batch after batch of cornbread batter. The kitchen filled with warm, homey scents. My mama always said, Caroline explained as she added seasoning to the stew, that good food needs 3 things: time, love, and just a little bit of magic. She sprinkled in her secret blend of spices, making Thomas laugh when she wouldn't tell him what they were. As the afternoon wore on, their shoulders ached and their feet grew tired, but neither complained. Caroline wiped sweat from her brow as she checked the cornbread in the oven. Thomas stirred the stew, his sleeves rolled up, totally focused on his task. You're good at this, Caroline observed, watching him taste test the stew with careful consideration. I had a good teacher, he replied, his eyes meeting hers with warmth. As evening approached, families began arriving at the church hall. Children ran ahead of their parents, drawn by the delicious smells. Caroline's heart swelled as she watched mothers and fathers, who usually held their heads down in shame, now sitting tall at the tables, being served with respect. The hall buzzed with conversation and laughter. Elderly Mrs. Johnson declared it was the best stew she'd had since her own mother's time. Little Tommy Adams came back for thirds of cornbread, his face covered in crumbs and joy. Thomas moved through the crowd, refilling drinks and chatting easily with everyone. He didn't act like the wealthy businessman he was just another member of the community, serving others with genuine care. Caroline stood by the kitchen door, taking in the scene before her. Families eating together, children playing between the tables, neighbors talking and laughing. This was what she'd hoped for, not just full bellies, but full hearts. Across the room, Thomas caught her eye. His smile was warm and proud, matching the hope that flickered in her own heart. As the sounds of grateful prayers and happy chatter filled the air, Caroline felt something shift inside her, a quiet certainty that maybe, just maybe, love could build bridges stronger than prejudice ever could tear down. The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when Caroline stepped onto her front porch, still in her flowered robe. The cool dawn air made her shiver as she bent to retrieve the newspaper that lay on her welcome mat. She almost missed her daily routine of fetching it, until the bold headline caught her eye and made her blood run cold. Millionaire duped? Local woman chasing fortune. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. There, on the front page, was a photograph of her and Thomas at the community dinner, but the caption beneath it twisted their charitable work into something ugly. The article painted her as a calculated gold digger, using her sob story to manipulate Thomas's kindness. Caroline sank onto her porch swing, the chains creaking as she read further. Anonymous sources claimed she had orchestrated the whole relationship, from the church social humiliation to the charity dinner. They quoted people describing her as desperate and opportunistic. Tears blurred her vision, but she forced herself to read every word. The article mentioned her weight repeatedly, suggesting she could never attract a man like Thomas Grayson without ulterior motives. They'd even dug up records of her modest home and income, presenting them as evidence of her supposed scheme. Inside her house, the phone started ringing. Caroline let it go to voicemail, knowing it would be well-meaning friends, or worse, reporters seeking comment. She could already imagine the whispers starting up again, stronger than ever. The sideways glances would turn into open stares, the murmurs into loud accusations. But it wasn't her own reputation that made her heart ache the most. The article questioned Thomas's judgment, suggesting he was either being fooled or having some sort of midlife crisis. They quoted business associates expressing concern about his recent behavior. His company's stock had even taken a small dip after news of their relationship spread. Caroline paced her small living room, the newspaper clutched in her hands. Every time she tried to put it down, another cruel phrase jumped out at her. Social climbing. Taking advantage. Embarrassment to the community. She thought of Thomas's kind eyes, his gentle hands chopping vegetables in her kitchen, his proud smile as they served others together. He didn't deserve this scrutiny, this mockery, all because he'd shown kindness to someone like her. Without stopping to change out of her robe, Caroline grabbed her car keys. The drive to Thomas's office building passed in a blur of tears and determination. She barely noticed the stairs as she marched through the lobby, past his protesting secretary. Thomas looked up from his desk, surprise and concern crossing his face as she burst in. Before he could speak, Caroline slammed the newspaper down on his polished desk, Her voice shook with emotion as she forced out the words that broke her heart to say, "This is destroying you. I won't let my presence ruin your life." She turned and walked out, ignoring his call of her name, letting the heavy office door close behind her with a final thud. The evening shadows lengthened across Caroline's small kitchen as she sat alone at her worn wooden table. A plate of her signature meatloaf and mashed potatoes sat untouched before her, growing cold in the dim light. The tick-tock of her grandmother's old wall clock echoed through the silence, marking each heavy moment. She traced her finger along the wood grain of the table, remembering how just days ago, Thomas had sat here with her, laughing as they shared a meal. Now that simple memory felt tainted by the cruel words in the newspaper. Her throat tightened as she pushed the plate away, unable to stomach even a bite. The sudden pounding on her front door made her jump. "Caroline," Thomas's voice carried through the wood, urgent and pleading. "Please, we need to talk about this." She closed her eyes, pressing her palms flat against the table to steady herself. Each knock felt like it shook the whole house. "You can't just walk away like this," he called out. "Not without letting me explain." Caroline rose slowly from her chair, moving to stand near the door but not opening it. She could sense him on the other side, probably still in his business suit from work, probably with that worried crease between his eyebrows she'd grown so fond of. "Those people in the paper, they don't know you," Thomas continued, his voice softening. "They don't know us. What we have is real, Caroline. You have to know that." Her hand hovered over the doorknob, as tears slid down her cheeks. The memory of the newspaper headlines flashed through her mind, the accusations, the mockery, the damage to his reputation. "Your company's stock dropped," she whispered to herself, remembering those numbers in red. "Your business partners are questioning you." The knocking became gentler, more rhythmic. "Caroline, please. Just open the door. We can face this together." She thought of the children who came to her for cookies and stories, how their parents might stop them now. She thought of the church community she'd served faithfully for years, how many had already turned against her. But most of all, she thought of Thomas, and D7, kind, successful Thomas, and how his whole world was being shaken because he'd chosen to stand beside her. Her fingers finally grasped the cool metal of the doorknob. She turned it slowly, opening the door just enough to see his face in the porch light. His eyes were filled with such hope, it nearly broke her resolve. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "I won't let them tear you apart because of me." Before he could respond, she gently closed the door, separating them once again. She stood there in the darkness of her hallway, listening to his presence on the other side, each second an eternity of what-ifs and might-have-beens. The morning sun crept through Caroline's kitchen window as she methodically packed containers of her homemade chicken soup. Steam rose from each portion as she secured the lids, her movements careful and deliberate. She had 6 containers for the Jenkins sisters, elderly twins who'd both come down with the flu, and 3 more for Mrs. Martinez, who'd just had surgery. Her kitchen timer chimed, and she pulled fresh cornbread from the oven, its golden brown crust filling the air with a warm, comforting aroma. This was her routine, her purpose. Others quietly, asking nothing in return. It felt safer than the whirlwind of emotions Thomas had stirred up in her life. At 9 o'clock sharp, Caroline made her way to the food pantry, keeping her eyes down as she passed the town square. She heard whispers follow her, but she refused to look up, clutching her purse closer to her chest. Inside the pantry, she found solace in the simple tasks, NDC, organizing cans, checking expiration dates, assembling food boxes for families in need. "Miss Caroline?" A small voice caught her attention. 10-year-old Maya stood in the doorway, holding a torn dress. "Mama said you might be able to fix it?" Caroline's face softened as she took the dress, examining the tear. "Of course, sweetheart. I'll have it ready by tomorrow." Throughout the day, she moved from one act of service to another. She delivered the soup to the Jenkins sisters, who squeezed her hands in gratitude. She helped Mrs. Martinez with her laundry, carefully folding each piece while the older woman rested. Between errands, she worked on Maya's dress, her needle weaving in and out with practiced precision. When Thomas's car drove past the food pantry, she ducked behind the shelves. When she heard his voice at Mrs. Martinez's house, he'd apparently started checking on the elderly himself. Caroline slipped out the back door. Each near miss left her heart aching, but she remained determined. This was better for everyone, she told herself. Better for him. As evening approached, Caroline finished her rounds. She'd delivered meals, mended clothes, stocked shelves, and comforted the sick, all while carefully avoiding both Thomas and the town gossips who seemed eager to catch her eye. Her feet were tired, but her heart was heavier. Back in her small bedroom, Caroline knelt beside her bed, clasping her hands together. The last rays of sunlight painted the walls in soft orange hues as she began to pray. "Lord," she whispered, her voice catching, "please, watch over Thomas. Give him the happiness he deserves. Even if that happiness can't include me. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she continued her prayer, asking for strength to keep going, to keep serving, to keep loving her community, even as she let go of the dream that had briefly brightened her world. Thomas sat in his oak-paneled office, his coffee growing cold as Pastor Richardson and 3 prominent business leaders from the Chamber of Commerce stood before his desk. Their faces were stern, their postures rigid with disapproval. "Think about your reputation, Thomas," James Miller, the bank president, said with forced patience. "The Grayson name means something in this town." Pastor Richardson cleared his throat. "And consider the example you're setting. This spectacle has gone on long enough." Thomas's jaw tightened as he remembered Caroline's laugh in her kitchen, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. He thought of her gentle hands preparing meals for the sick, her patience with children who needed mending done. "Spectacle?" Thomas's voice was quiet but firm. "Is that what you call it when someone shows kindness to others? When they serve this community without asking anything in return?" "Now, Thomas," Bernard Cooper, the real estate developer, interjected, "we're not saying she isn't a nice woman, but surely you can see how this looks." Thomas stood slowly, his hands flat on his desk. "How it looks? I'll tell you what I see. I see a woman who gave me bread when I was hungry as a child, who comforts the sick and helps the elderly, who teaches children to read at the library without pay." He walked to his window, watching children play in the street below. Every memory of Caroline flooded back, over and over, her embarrassed smile when he complimented her cooking, her quiet strength as she served others despite the cruel whispers, the genuine joy she took in helping anyone in need. "If I walk away," Thomas said, turning back to face them, "I become one of them. One of the people who judge without knowing, who mock without cause, who tear down instead of build up." The men shifted uncomfortably as Thomas returned to his desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. "Gentlemen, I believe we're done here. I have a speech to prepare for the town meeting." Pastor Richardson stepped forward. "Thomas, please consider." "No." Thomas cut him off firmly. "You've had your say, now I'll have mine, at the town meeting, and I suggest you all be there to hear it." After they left, Thomas began writing, his pen moving swiftly across the paper. He would tell them about the real Caroline, about her quiet dignity, her generous heart, her unwavering faith. He would remind them of what community truly meant, of how love should overcome prejudice. His determination grew with each word he wrote. This speech wouldn't just defend Caroline, would challenge the very foundations of their small-minded thinking. He wouldn't let her stand alone anymore, no matter the cost. The wooden benches of the town hall creaked under the weight of what seemed like the entire community. Evening light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across worried faces. The air felt thick with tension and whispered judgments. Thomas stood at the podium, his fingers smoothing the papers before him. His usual confident demeanor showed no trace of nervousness, though his heart pounded beneath his crisp white shirt. Just then, the back door opened quietly, and Caroline slipped in, staying close to the shadows. No one noticed her presence as she pressed herself against the wall, her hands clasped tightly together. "I've called this meeting," Thomas began, his voice clear and strong, "because I need to speak about love. Not just any love, but the kind that serves without recognition, that gives without expecting return." He straightened his shoulders, scanning the faces before him. "You all know Caroline Walker, or perhaps you think you do. You see her size, her color, but you don't see her heart. Let me tell you what I see." Thomas's voice grew warmer as he continued. "I see a woman who spends her Saturdays teaching children to read at the library, who cooks meals for every funeral in this town, even for families who've mocked her, who visits our elderly when everyone else has forgotten them." From the back of the room, Caroline's eyes filled with tears as Thomas spoke. She hadn't known he'd noticed all these things. Last winter, a voice suddenly called out. Mrs. Peterson, the widow who lived on Oak Street, stood shakily. "When I was sick with pneumonia, Caroline came every day. She cooked, cleaned, never asked for a dime." Another person rose, Mr. Jenkins, the school janitor. "My kids were hungry after my accident. Caroline brought us dinner for 2 weeks straight." Like a wave, people began standing, one after another. "She helped my mother learn to write again after her stroke," someone called out. "She made my daughter's prom dress when we couldn't afford one. She prayed with me all night when my husband was in surgery." The testimonies continued, filling the hall with stories of quiet kindness, of humble service, of love shown through actions rather than words. Thomas stood silent at the podium, watching as the truth of Caroline's character emerged through the voices of those she'd helped. The hall gradually fell into a reverent silence, the weight of realization settling over the crowd. In the back, Caroline stood with tears streaming down her face, witnessing the impact her simple acts of kindness had made on her community. The crowd's murmurs faded as Thomas made his way through the parting sea of people. Caroline stood at the back, tears flowing freely down her cheeks, her hands trembling at her sides. The evening light through the windows cast a warm glow around her, making her tears glisten like diamonds. Thomas moved with purpose, his footsteps echoing in the hushed hall. When he reached her, he didn't hesitate. Right there, in front of everyone, he lowered himself to one knee. The gesture drew gasps from the crowd, but Thomas only had eyes for Caroline. "Caroline Walker," he said, his voice thick with emotion but clear enough for all to hear. "I said I will, and I will, always." His hand reached for hers, steady and sure. Caroline's breath caught in her throat as she looked down at this man, this wonderful man who saw her true worth. Her heart felt so full it might burst. Through happy tears, she whispered a trembling, "Yes." Thomas rose to his feet, gently pulling Caroline up with him. The town hall, which moments ago had been silent, erupted in thunderous applause. The sound swelled, filling every corner of the room with joy and acceptance, washing away the last remnants of prejudice and doubt. The summer sun painted golden streaks through the stained glass windows as Caroline Walker stood at the church entrance. Her simple white gown flowed gracefully, highlighting her natural beauty. Her hands clutched a bouquet of wildflowers, steadying her racing heart. Down the aisle, little Emma and Sarah, girls she'd tutored after school, scattered rose petals with gleaming smiles. In the pews, Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Thompson, widows she'd cooked countless meals for, dabbed at their eyes with embroidered handkerchiefs. The familiar faces of townspeople filled every bench, their expressions now warm and welcoming. Some who had once whispered cruel words, now sat with heads bowed in quiet reflection. At the altar, Thomas Grayson stood tall and proud, his eyes never leaving Caroline as she made her way toward him. When she reached his side, he took her hands in his, strong and steady. His voice, meant only for her ears, carried all the love and promise of their journey together. "I will, always," he whispered, the words floating between them like a sacred vow. Caroline's smile lit up her entire face, radiating joy and peace. Above them, the church bells began to peal, their joyous sound echoing across the town square. The congregation rose as one, celebrating not just the union of two hearts, but the triumph of love over prejudice, of healing over hurt, of redemption over rejection. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.